So welcome back, and basically what I want to do is continue on where I left off before and posing the question, what is it that we can do? What can be done to mitigate the ethical concerns that are associated with DAOs, to deal with the risks that were highlighted in the last video or the last recording? Clearly, one approach is to design DAOs with transparency and accountability in mind. This could mean that we're creating mechanisms for stakeholders to provide feedback, to hold the organisation accountable, or building in safeguards to prevent the organisation from being used for illegal activities. Another approach would be to incorporate ethical considerations into governance structures of the DAO. For example, the DAO could have a code of conduct that sets out the ethical principles and values that the organisation is committed to upholding, and these could be reviewed regularly. The organisation could also have an independent ethics committee, perhaps, or an ombudsman or similar, that's responsible for overseeing its ethical standards. But is any of this actually practical? Typically, token owners put forward proposals about DAO's operations, and then the community will vote on each idea. So it's not unusual for a lot of discussion and ideation to occur around the proposals on messaging platforms like Discord or Twitter. If the final vote is in favour of the proposal, a smart contract is going to enforce the activity. Of course, voting procedures are going to differ from one DAO to another, and some of them range things like simple majority, some of them have quadratic voting, in which case a person will get an allocation of votes and then can place more than one vote for a proposal if they strongly support it. Information related to issues like currency transactions and internal decisions are available for everybody to see on a blockchain. This transparency forms part of the basis for trust amongst the members, but it also can end up with inequity between members. One of the discussions in the podcast discussion that I've asked you to listen to, looking at the governance issues, talks about the potential for inequity. The more money you have, the more tokens you can buy, the more votes you get. Also, when you think about it, say you've got an HR, a performance issue within an organisation, do you really want the whole of the organisation and its investors and potentially suppliers as well knowing about an internal HR or performance management issue, voting on whether or not that employee gets to stay, whether their work is good enough? Is that really conducive to a great outcome? An important feature in the DAO process is that voting mechanisms are defined in advance, which means in a blockchain immutable environment that they can't easily be modified. Of course, that's completely different from what happens in a traditional organization, where a CEO or a CFO can effectively ignore consensus when they're making a decision. In a DAO, the community votes on activities like spending money, though the scope of the decisions that can be made this way is way more limited than in a traditional organisation. Once everyone agrees to the rules, there's no ambiguity or wiggle room in how they're applied. But the nature of a corporation is such that when corporations were developed, think back to Solomon and Solomon, effectively a corporation is an artificial mechanism that allows a gentleman to take a risk with another gentleman's money. As they point out in the podcast that I've asked you to listen to, that actually a traditional organization, it's about taking risks. It's about taking the bet that other people aren't taking. If we rely on a consensus mechanism in a very large DAO, we're always going to get the average outcome. And as in the Smart Cities TED Talk, you see, the transparency that arose with the group that came together as a DAO to try and buy the US Constitution was probably the downfall of that particular investment decision, because the transparency meant that other people knew how much they could spend and what their voting or their bidding strategy would be. Adhering to smart contract enforced decisions means a DAO is less suited to commercial situations with a lot of ambiguity, or those where success comes from organizational dynamism being organizationally dynamic. Dynamism is a word I've never been able to say. The ability to adapt to subtle changes in market conditions, including early stage markets that are being formed for innovative product and services. This is what corporations and traditional management is really good at when it's done well. And it's really hard to see how a DAO can come in and replace that, given the nature and the timing required for the consensus mechanisms to work. So at early stage, particularly in business, entrepreneurs need to make judgments using incomplete data. They're often iterating at speed. Silicon Valley, right? We're hearing pivot, pivot, pivot all the time. Is that actually realistically possible using a DAO? To me, it doesn't look so, but it's really interesting to think about this question. And writing detailed smart contracts to support the work is going to be really difficult, if not impossible. One of the things that makes lawyers valuable is our ability to consider and foresee risks and try and address them in traditional contracts. Often it's experience in an industry that allows us to do that. But we know that we can't foresee every potential circumstance. And so while the idea of a smart contract that has a clear path for every different situation that it can execute is really, really intriguing to me, really fascinating. To the extent that we can do it, I think we should do it. It will save a lot of time and effort and money. But for many, many contracts, that's never going to be possible. And that all we can do is highlight and identify the most important risks. So basically on this slide, I've tried the slide here. I hope I've spoken about all of these things yet. I might not have. I think there are a couple of issues that we need to think about. So just in summary, we need to think about the voting mechanisms. More tokens, more votes. That might not always be the right best thing. I think decision fatigue and guaranteeing engagement are kind of two sides of the same coin. How do we make sure that the people who need to vote, who need to be involved in the decision making, do in fact get involved? I've raised some issues about whether transparency is always appropriate and always useful. It can be commercially damaging, and also we've got to think about humans who are involved. I think total transparency in a HR environment, maybe I just haven't got my head into the space yet, but I can't see how that can work in a productive and kind and human-centered way. But on the other hand, in large organizations, it can be really difficult to know who to trust. But also in a decentralized environment, actually, do you know the motivations behind what it is that people are putting up proposals for? And of course, we're still in the Wild West here. And it kind of amuses me that the city DAO is buying up property in Wyoming, and that it is Wyoming that has opened up its laws to allow for DAOs in a more useful way, because that's cowboy country, right? And this is cowboy country. There are a lot of people who have been punting on crypto and on tokens. They don't necessarily know what it is that they're doing or how they're staking or what any of that means. Just having a go. They're trying to make a little bit of money. And again, do you really want those people making decisions about the future of your business? Of course, one of the biggest risks that we have is this high level of uncertainty about the regulatory status. As an emergent form of commercial organisation, DAOs are not yet fully accounted for in a legal sense, and many are pushing traditional boundaries. For most jurisdictions, there are questions around issues like how a DAO should file and pay taxes, or how can it sign a legally binding contract? Can it sue? Can it be sued? The majority of existing DAOs are unregistered and have really uncertain legal status. And so they're really considered sort of illegal rather than illegal. This certainty could be detrimental to the development of DAOs, this uncertainty could be detrimental to their development. But conforming to existing rules is also really difficult. As we were talking about in recording number 4, trying to plug this square peg into a round hole could be really difficult. The very nature of a decentralized organization means that there's no need for officers and directors, but these people are important. Those roles are really important in organizations because they make decisions and they take responsibility, especially when things start to go awry. The transnational membership base of DAOs adds to the legal complexity of these organizations or groups. Knowing who you're dealing with is an important foundation for most economic activity as well. In the last couple of years, we've seen internationally a range of prohibitions against dealing with Russian money, for example. But when you're in a DAO, and the concept of anonymity and pseudonymity means you can't for sure know who you're dealing with. You may well be breaching those laws without having any way of finding out whether or not you're dealing with the people that you think you're dealing with, or not dealing with the people that you're not allowed to deal with. The foundation of knowing who it is that you're dealing with makes it possible for entities to sue, to be sued, to enter into contractual agreements, as well as to acquire, hold, develop, and dispose of property rights. Traditional corporations meet this identifiability standard and have long been recognised as right and duty-bearing units. In other words, they're subject to rights, they have liabilities that are defined by the legal systems in which they operate. Most jurisdictions around the world require a company to provide a unique name or a company identifier of some sort. They need to have a physical office address. They need to have at least one director or officer resident in the country so that they can be contacted, that they can answer questions, that they can comply with the law and be held accountable. And so in Australia now, even company directors have a unique identifier number which needs to be entered into a formal business register so people know who it is that you're dealing with. And so we've got these kind of opposing issues that are happening, and if DAOs want to be successful, they're going to need to comply to a certain extent. The case study that I've thrown into you, there's a TED talk from the founder of the City DAO, which is basically started, so it's Scott Fitzsimmons, started by a tweet that he sent back in July 2021. And basically, this is in response to the state of Wyoming setting a precedent as the first state, so it's an American state, but also compared to nations as well, that's established a set of regulations for decentralized autonomous organizations. And so basically, a DAO that wants to operate within Wyoming has a clear set of rules. DAOs in Wyoming are now recognized as a unique type of limited liability company. So that they've got the denominator LLC, one we don't have in Australia, but it's kind of similar to a proprietary limited company in Australia. So it has legal personality, it has a range of rights, including that limitation on liability for its members. Without this kind of protection, DAOs might be considered general partnerships. In the US, in Australia, they are most likely to fall within the partnership law, which means that members are at risk for personal liability relating to the actions or obligations that the partnership or the DAO takes on. Every DAO needs to appoint a registered agent. So in Wyoming, they need to have a registered agent, so a resident who's responsible for maintaining a physical address and a registry of names and addresses for the directors or equivalent individuals. So City DAO, the case study on the slide, you can basically see just kind of a scroll through of its website. City DAO was established in July 2021, around the same time as these laws were set up, following a tweet that Scott Fitzsimmons set out. A group of founders, they came from all over the world, Germany, US, Ireland, Canada, basically came together with the goal of constructing a city of the future using the Ethereum blockchain. So they wanted to decentralize asset ownership by tokenizing land, rights, and governance. These days, it looks like there are about 10,000 investors. More than $7 million has been raised. City DAO's inaugural investment, they call it Parcel Zero, was a 40-acre tract of land in Wyoming, because that's where the laws are. The acquisition was considered a low-risk venture and a stepping stone for the organisation as it explores new opportunities. Currently, City DAO citizens receive NFTs that represent governance rights, such as proposals and votings or activities, but it doesn't give them direct ownership in real-world land. Members can vote on the DAO's activities without receiving direct returns in the form of expected earnings. The arrangement's designed to prevent conflicts with federal securities laws. If ownership includes a reasonable expectation of profit derived from others' efforts, remember the Howey test that I mentioned earlier, the US SEC Commissioner classifies it as an investment contract, necessitating adherence to security registration, information disclosure, similar to an IPO. The undoing in the end of the DAO discussed in the previous recording. While these regulations are likely to evolve, they continue to pose challenges for DAOs, both in the US and everywhere else. Last two things I want to talk about very, very quickly. You've got two key readings in this week. Make sure that you have a good look at them. I think you'll find them very helpful. The Moore reading was quoted in the Australian Law Reform Commission report extensively, and I think it gives us some really interesting guidance for things to think about. It's got a really good section setting out the mechanics of the process for a DAO, which I think you'll find very useful. I think some of the parts dealing with the complexity of voting talks a bit about multi-token voting. I must admit, and I put this on the slide, this reminds me of the News Corp voting structure. Many of you will know News Corp and wonder why the hell is it that the Murdoch family have got so much control over that company. Well, for a very long time, News Corp has had two classes of shares. Class A, which basically has no voting rights but has financial consequences, and Class B, which has voting rights attached to it. Well, the Murdoch family own almost 40% of the voting shares in that company. Now, because that company's been extremely profitable, people have been prepared to have no vote at all, which is kind of the opposite of what happens in a DAO, right? So everybody gets a vote as opposed to nobody gets a vote, but there are financial returns. I want to point that out because voting as a mechanism for establishing value is something that we can play with in a traditional corporation as well. I think the other thing that Moore points out really well and really coherently is the way that DAOs tend to be, we see this language, wrapped or unwrapped. So to get around the partnership problem, many of them are wrapped in a LLC, so a Delaware or in some other state. Now, other than in Wyoming and Vermont, those LLCs are traditional equivalents of proprietary limited companies. And so why do I point that out? Because these wrapped DAOs, they're wrapped around a legal structure. Now, that's not as easily available in Australia because in most US states, perhaps all of them as far as I know, it is possible to have something that is a member managed LLC. So no directors as such. And so the LLC can be managed by the votes of the DAO, by consensus. It is not possible to have a corporate entity registered under the Australian law that doesn't have at least one director and at least one shareholder. And so a proprietary limited company needs to have at least one, needs to have one shareholder. Similarly, a public company basically has limited liability for the members. The members can change around, but basically once you have 50 members or more, you need to be a public company in Australia, which means you need to have 3 directors, but also means that you can't have a provision that effectively limits who the owners of the company are. You need to be able to, basically, they need to be able to trade shares without the directors saying yes or no to those trades, which again, when you have DAOs that require an approval of the token holders before a new token holder can be admitted, that's going to be counterintuitive and it's not going to work. The next reading that you have, the Gomez reading, is nice and brief. It's easy to read. I think you will enjoy it. What I thought was particularly useful about her article, and Selena Gomez she's a partner of a very large international law firm, Clifford Chance. She knows what she's talking about, so listen to what she's talking about. Particularly have a look at sort of the last part of her article, where she's talking about some practical things to think about when you're setting up a DAO, and I think you'll find that quite useful. You can read, I'm not going to read it to you, but have a look at that. Questions, concerns, frustrations, compliments. I look forward to talking to you about all of these things in the tutorial. Cheers.